Hello, chess fans! There is a good chance you know the quote, "Pawns are the soul of chess." This quote is taken from Philidor's book, and the full quote, when translated to English, is, "They are the soul of chess. It is they which uniquely determine the attack and the defense, and on their good or bad arrangement depends entirely the winning or losing of the game. You can imagine them as the scaffolding of a position. They determine weaknesses, ideas, and plans. So as you can see, a very important part of chess. Here in this video, I will show you some patterns that can appear in pawn structures and the resulting plans. Let's get into it. Number 1. The isolated pawn. A pawn is isolated when it has no pawns of the same color on the files next to it. In this position, the d4 and the f5 pawn are isolated. There are no white pawns on the files next to the d4 and no black ones next to the f5. Isolated pawns are usually more vulnerable to attacks, since they aren't supported by other pawns in a chain. By the way, a pawn chain looks like this. Pawn chains are helpful because the pawns in the chain protect each other very well. The player who has the isolated pawn will often try to get rid of it. One common example for an opening where you can get an isolated pawn is the pawn of attack in the Caro-Kann defense, which happens after e4, c6, d4, d5, e takes d5, c takes d5, and then c4. If black now takes d takes c4, bishop takes c4, the d4 pawn is isolated. An isolated pawn can either be weak or strong. It often depends on what pawn breaks are available. When you are playing against the isolated pawn, you should exchange as many minor pieces as possible, since the opponent then has less pieces to defend and use for other purposes, giving him a lot less compensation. And you can then continue pressuring it with your heavy pieces. Now, if you have the isolated pawn, you should then not exchange minor pieces. Instead, try to exchange the opponent's rooks, so he has a harder time attacking. Note that an isolated pawn on a closed file is a lot safer, because the enemy's rooks have a harder time accessing it. Number 2. The doubled pawn. Doubled pawns are pawns that are of the same color and placed on the same file. Here in this position, b3 and b4 are doubled pawns, and e6 and e7. Since doubled pawns cannot protect each other and are less flexible than normal pawns, these are usually deemed weak. However, they can also be beneficial for your position. They are great protectors of squares, especially in closed or semi-closed positions. Like in this position, for example. These doubled pawns protect all important squares. But when we talk about double isolated pawns in an open position, most of the times they are weak. The main problem with doubled pawns is, as said, they can't protect each other, and when they are also isolated, the player playing against them will often have an easy time attacking them. Doubled pawns can happen very easily, for example in the opening, when one player takes the other's knight. Often, beginners are told to avoid these like the plague. And while it's true that most of the times they are weak, still keep in mind the possibility that in certain positions they can also be useful. Number 3. The backward pawn. A pawn is backward when it is behind its colleagues in the pawn chain and cannot be moved forward easily, most often due to the opponent's pawns. Here you can see an example. e3 and g6 are backwards. If you would push them now, they would just be taken. So, they are great targets for attacks. Here you can apply one of the principles for when playing against an isolated pawn. When you are the player attacking the backward pawn, try to trade the minor pieces. And if the pawn is in an open or semi-open file, stack your heavy pieces on it. You can also place a piece in front of the pawn if there is a chance that the pawn could move forward in the future. Ideally, that would be a rook or a queen, because then it would be still attacking it. Now, if you are the player with the backward pawn, just reverse these principles. Don't trade your minor pieces, trade heavy pieces, and look for opportunities to get rid of it or create counterplay. Number 4. The passed pawn. A passed pawn is a pawn that has no enemy pawns in its way to promotion. That means no pawns in front or on the files next to it. Here are some examples. a3 and h3 are passed pawns. e4 isn't, because there is still the d6 pawn next to it. Passers can be incredibly strong. A good rule of thumb is, the farther the pawn is advanced, the stronger it is. They can often appear in endgames where one player has a pawn majority on one side. Here is a basic example. White here can create a passed pawn with b5. Black has no other pawns to defend the a6 and either has to push or take. After a takes b5, the b5 is now a passed pawn. Passed pawns are especially strong in kings versus pawns endgames, since there are no long-ranged pieces to stop any passers on the other side of the board, meaning the defending side has to be very careful on where to place the king. The best piece to block a passed pawn is a knight, since it can still work properly even when placed in front of a pawn. The queen, on the other hand, isn't that great at blocking. It is very inflexible and also vulnerable to attacks. Here's the comparison. Another problem with the queen as a defender is that alone it can't keep a proper blockade. So in queens versus pawns endgames, the stronger side can win like this, just pushing the pawn as much as possible, while trying to trade queens. But passed pawns can also be weak. In endgames, for example, when there are less pieces on the board and all of your moves need to revolve around protecting it, just so you don't lose it. So keep that in mind. Number 5. Pawn islands. Now, a more general term. A pawn island is one or a formation of pawns that are on adjacent files. A pawn island is separate from another when there is one file of space between them, like you can see here. These pawns are one island, here is actually two files of space between them, and here's the next one. Usually, the less individual pawn islands a player has, the better, because then the pawns are normally stronger because they are connected. Just compare white's position to black's. Black will have a way harder time defending all of his pawns. Number 6. Hanging pawns. Last but not least, these are two pawns that are next to each other but otherwise isolated from their colleagues. As you can see here, d5 and e5 are hanging pawns. Similar to the other pawn structures, they can either be a weakness or a strength depending on the position. Since they are isolated from the other pawns, they could become targets, but they are also useful for initiating pawn breaks and possibly creating a passed pawn. Okay, this is it. Now you know a lot of important terms about pawn structures and the resulting principles when playing in these instances. One important thing to note though, like all principles in chess, these do not apply for every position, even if the structure that is connected to them is present. Principles are just the general guide on what to do based on the weaknesses and strengths of an aspect. So don't always take these by the word and make your evaluations based on all factors of a position. I hope you learned a thing or two from this video. If you enjoyed it, I would be happy about a comment and a thumbs up. And if you want weekly chess content in the future, you can subscribe so you don't miss any of my videos. Have a great day, see you next time, and until then, GG's!